Dr. Ann Cavoukian, Executive Director at Global Privacy Security by Design Center.
So let's start. I always like to start by, in the next slide, please, and Fernando is going to help me advance the slides. Let's dispel the myths. There's so many myths about privacy. Next slide, please. One of the biggest myths is that privacy is all about having something to hide. Next slide, please. Privacy is not about secrecy. It's not about having something to hide. It drives me crazy when people say that. Privacy, next slide, please, is all about control. And in the next slide, I talk about privacy is all about personal control. It's about you as the user being in control of your personal information. Freedom of choice is critical. You have to be the one to decide to whom you wish to disclose your information and how it should be used. The Germans have a wonderful term for this called informational self-determination. I love it. It's all about the individual determining the fate of his or her personal information. In the next slide, I also outline why privacy is so important. Next slide, please. See, privacy is absolutely essential to freedom. I want to talk to you about privacy by design. I created it in my first term as Privacy Commissioner. In 1997, I was Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada for 3 terms. And when I first created it, it was interesting because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a psychologist. I studied psychology and the law. And when I joined the Privacy Commission as commissioner, I had to work with my lawyers, all the lawyers in the office, and they all believed in, you have a privacy law, you apply it after the data breach or after the privacy infraction and get a resolution. I wanted a different approach. I wanted to be proactive. I wanted to prevent the privacy harms from arising. So over 3 nights at my kitchen table at home, I created Privacy by Design, and then I took it in and I sold it to my lawyers because I had to convince them of the merits of Privacy by Design, which I did. And we've had great success with it. It took just over 10 years, but then it was unanimously passed as an international standard by the International Assembly of Data Protection Commissioners and Privacy Commissioners. They have an annual conference, and in 2010, it was in Jerusalem, and that's where it was unanimously passed as an international standard. And we've had great success with it since then. Next slide, please. What I always like to remind everyone, especially lawyers, is that the majority of the privacy harms, it's like an iceberg. We don't see them. Most privacy breaches remain unknown, unchallenged, undetected. And as regulators, as privacy commissioners, we only see the tip of the iceberg. The majority of the breaches are largely unknown. That's why regulatory compliance through privacy laws alone is unsustainable, because it always comes in after the privacy breach. We want to ensure proactive privacy by design being baked into the code, built into all of our operations, so that ideally we can prevent privacy harms from arising and ensure the future of privacy. And we've had great success with this. In the next slide, please. You'll see that it's been translated into 40 languages. And if you have a language that doesn't appear here, come and talk to me. In the next slide, I want to tell you the 2 essentials to privacy by design. There are 2 very important points. The first is you have to prevent the privacy harms from arising. Next slide, please. And I've already talked about that. You have to be proactive. But I also want to talk about banish zero-sum models. What do I mean by that? Next slide, please. Zero-sum means it's win-lose, either or. You can have privacy or security. Privacy versus data utility. Nonsense. Get rid of that. So yesterday, next slide, please. Instead, you substitute what's called positive sum. Privacy and security. Privacy and data utility. You can have both. We have to create a win-win scenario, not an either or, involving unnecessary trade-offs and false dichotomies. We can do this. In the next slide, please. You'll see that we've had great luck operationalizing this. And let me just walk you through the 7 foundational principles. I've covered most of them. You want to prevent the harms from arising by being proactive. Let me talk to you about number 2, privacy as the default setting. This is critical. What it means is you don't wait for the individual, the consumer, to ask for privacy. And you don't expect them to wade through all the terms of service and all the legalese and the privacy policy to find the opt-out box that says, do not use my personal information for any other purpose. No one has time to do that. It takes hours. Privacy as the default setting means they don't have to do that. It means privacy is the default, meaning it is embedded into our operations. You don't have to ask for it. We give it to you automatically. That's huge. And that's also been included in other laws that have arisen. Privacy embedded in design speaks for itself. You bake it into the code, it's always present. Full functionality, I just talked to you about that, how very important it is to do positive sum, privacy and security, not zero sum, one versus the other. Get rid of that. Now, number 5, while the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, in this day and age, if you don't have a solid foundation of security from end to end with full lifecycle protection, you're not going to have any privacy. You have to start with a solid base of security. Visibility and transparency is so important. Keep it open. I tell companies, you have to let your customers access their data on your operations. And companies have come back to me who have become certified for privacy by design, and they say they love that because when customers access their data on a company, they say, oh, no, that piece of information, that was from 2 years ago. Here's the current information. So companies have told me it increases the accuracy and the quality of their information. Win-win. And respect for user privacy. When you keep it user-centric, all of this flows beautifully. It works hand in hand. So these are the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design. They're not hard to do, although companies have told me it requires some adjustment until they get the actual foundation right. Next slide, please. And just in case you think, well, it sounds good, but it's too hard to do, au contraire. We have this is a paper I wrote with the major companies who have been certified for privacy by design. They're doing it. All of these different areas, surveillance cameras, biometrics, smart meters, mobile communications, NFCs, RFIDs and sensor technologies, remote home healthcare, privacy protective surveillance, smart data, all of this incorporates privacy by design. I'll give you an example, remote home healthcare. A lot of elderly people would like to remain in their homes, even though they may need some help from time to time. So Intel developed this wonderful system where they could attach sensors onto various parts of the home with the consent, of course, total consent of the person living there, to alert in them if the person needed help. For example, let's say someone gets up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, but they don't return within a predetermined period of time. The sensor goes off, it's encrypted, it only goes to Intel and those who have been permitted to access the information, and then Intel sends help to see if the person has fallen or something has happened. So all of this follows privacy by design very closely. We can do this. I can tell you, it's being done all over the world. Next slide, please. And just in case, oh, this is a letter I got from the Japanese Information Processing Development Center just before the end of my last term as commissioner. And they said, we've heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of positive sum, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design. And I love this because English isn't the first language of the Japanese community, of course. But I thought if they could understand this, so can everyone else who speaks other languages. Next slide, please.
Just
Are we okay?
Yes, just a second here. Yes.
Okay. And if you think, well, what's this going to cost me? It's going to cost too much. Of course, there is a small cost involved in being proactive about privacy and embedding it into your operations. But it is tiny compared to the cost you will incur if you don't do this, because the cost of data breaches and privacy infractions these days are enormous. In Canada and the United States, they're no longer lawsuits. They're class action lawsuits that cost companies millions of dollars. But they say that the damage to your brand, the damage to your reputation may be far worse than the cost. So get smart, get proactive, and build it in. Now, let me turn in the next slide to the GDPR. You've heard of the General Data Protection Regulation that came into effect in 2018 in the European Union, which strengthened data protection and privacy, and it gave citizens control over their personal data. Remember that privacy is all about control. And in the next slide, what really pleased me as well was that the GDPR, in the next slide, please. What I was very pleased about, that the GDPR also included my privacy by design, data protection by design, and privacy as the default specifically. Remember, privacy as the default is the second of the 7 foundational principles. So I was delighted. In the next slide, please. There was also a comment written in Information Age, and it referred to the fact that my privacy by design, which has had a large influence on security experts and policymakers, regulators, is referenced heavily in Article 25 of the GDPR. And they said it's not too much of a stretch that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the GDPR. I assure you there's much more to the GDPR than privacy by design. But I think the point they're making here is that if you do privacy by design, you'll automatically meet a lot of the requirements of the GDPR. So it's a win-win. And in the next slide, please. We, as I mentioned, we certify, I work with KPMG to certify companies who want to indicate that they're doing privacy by design. And in the next slide, I also offer a course at Ryerson University on the global privacy framework. In the next slide, please. And this is offered online if you have any interest in taking this course. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to turn to some negative information, and then I'm going to go positive again. So just wait. But I have to tell you, the tide has been turning towards surveillance for some time, dating back, in the next slide, please, to 2016. In the United Kingdom, they passed the Investigatory Powers Bill. In the next slide, please. And unfortunately, there was so much resistance to it, over 100,000 signatures opposing this bill. But unfortunately, it wasn't sufficient. In the next slide, please. This mass digital surveillance regime was ruled unlawful, and it's been ruled to have breached the European Union directive because it allows data to be harvested for reasons other than fighting serious crime. And in the next slide, please. Once again, this petition to repeal new surveillance powers, which was over 100,000. And unfortunately, the UK still has this. In the next slide, I talk about surveillance becoming the new normal. In the next slide, please. The new normal of the internet. And this is heartbreaking for me. And this wasn't my term. In the next slide, please. Bruce Schneier, who is a brilliant cryptographer, one of the best, he said, Anne, I'm sorry, but surveillance is the business model of the internet now. And he said this in 2017. He'd probably still say this now, unfortunately. In the next slide, please, I talk about the unintended consequences of data. the increasing availability of what they're calling data fumes. That's data that is produced as a byproduct of people's uses of tech devices and services. And this has both political and practical implications for how people are seen and treated by both the government in the state and the private sector. These data fumes can be extremely damaging. And in the next slide, please, I talk about the Internet of Things. IoT attacks are happening almost automatically, and it's not when, it's when, not if they're going to happen. The question the company should no longer be asking is whether there will be an attack involving Internet of Things, devices and infrastructure, but when. It's going to happen. People have been so enamored with IoT, they're running out the door without giving the necessary thought to what needs to be protected in IoT. In the next slide, please. And this is dating back to 2016. In 2016, there's 1.1 billion identities stolen. I imagine now, 2022, 5 years later, this is probably doubled. And when your identity is stolen, it is a nightmare. When I was privacy commissioner, I helped victims of identity theft who would come to me for help. And I would say the first thing you do is you go to the police, file an occurrence report, something to substantiate your claim that your identity is stolen. And then I would try to help them as best I could. Next slide, please. And this is why we need encryption. The vital need for encryption is critical. In the next slide, please. If you have the time to read it, this is an op-ed that I wrote for Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, how encryption is crucial to our privacy and freedom. It is absolutely critical because when you encrypt data, especially with end-to-end encryption, then you can send it securely to the person you are intending to receive your email, and they can open it, and it's just end-to-end encryption. No one else can gain access to it. It's amazing. In the next slide, please. There's been, unfortunately, a lot of debate over encryption, which is crazy. Because of a lot of terrorist attacks, they said, well, we have to give the encryption keys over to the government so they can gain access to it if there's an incident. Wrong. Giving the government keys to encrypted software will make, this was an American article, Americans less secure, not more. And in the next slide, please, a group of brilliant cryptographers wrote a paper called Keys Under Doormats. And I loved it because, in the next slide, please, that was a term they used to make it understandable to people. Just like you might give your child a key that lives under the doormat so that if they lose their key, they can come and still gain access to the house. Mandating insecurity is what will happen by requiring government access to all our data and communications. That's what will happen. If you give the government our encryption keys, it will make everything worse, not better. And this is like over a dozen brilliant cryptographers at MIT who wrote this paper. Please take a look at it. It is compelling. And I can't tell you how important it is. How it just is absolutely critical. And the next slide, please. We talk about finding a needle in a haystack. The Economist wrote a paper years ago, and they said, many would argue that granting intelligence agencies further powers to intercept, collect, decrypt personal data only exacerbates their problem of finding the terrorist needle in the public haystack, because it is a needle under a haystack. And there's no way by giving the keys, our encryption keys to governments, that it's going to help anything. In the next slide, please. What does actually work, there are things that work, is the question asked repeatedly since the intelligence agencies embarked on their wholesale wiretapping of private citizens is, does profiling hundreds of millions of good guys help to unmask the few dozen bad guys in their midst? It doesn't. It doesn't at all. Next slide, please. What does work is targeted surveillance versus indiscriminate surveillance, which mount to fishing expeditions. In the next slide, please, I talk about Professor David Lyon, who talked about a surveillance winter and how the chilling effect it would have on freedom. He said communications metadata were recently described by a task force set up to review the Patriot Act in the United States as Section 215 metadata as having no use in stopping terrorist attacks. Many security experts insist that much more targeted surveillance works far better. We need to have targeted surveillance, not massive surveillance. And in the next slide, please, we talk about the need for both privacy and security. This is right from Homeland Security. I've worked with Michael Chertoff when he was the Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States. And he said, you can't have privacy without security. Of course, to me, the most frustrating thing is when people treat privacy and security as if they were trade-offs. They're not. You must have both. And the next slide, please. We also have another NSA chief, Michael Rogers, said the same thing. Encryption is foundational to our future, and we'll forget about arguing about it. Next slide, please. We have the tech group rejects calls for data encryption backdoors. A backdoor is giving the government a key to encryption. And weakening encryption in the name of national security simply makes no sense. And in the next slide, please. Leading crypto experts. I loved Susan Landau, is a brilliant crypto expert, cryptographer. She said, rather than providing us with better security, the FBI's efforts to mandate the creation of crypto backdoors will torpedo it. Encryption and other protections secure our systems and should never be undermined. Excellent advice. Next slide, please. Now, the good news, the business case for privacy is so important. In the next slide, please. Please remember this, privacy is good for business. Yes, it is. The next slide, please. I always say that privacy should be viewed as a business issue, not a compliance issue. If you think strategically and transform privacy into a competitive business advantage, you both win. And in the next slide, please. I've already given you this slide. The cost of being proactive is tiny compared to the cost of a data breach and class action lawsuits. Next slide, please. There's an excellent article that actually appeared first in the Las Vegas International Consumer Electronics Show, and it was called Privacy Marketplace. Consumers are asking about privacy. They were delighted. Privacy is a hot issue now. It's on everyone's radar. Consumers are asking about privacy. That's the big takeaway. And this was huge because it showed companies, yeah, people care about privacy. Let's build it in. Next slide, please. Consumers value privacy. 75% will not buy a product from a company, no matter how great the products are, if they don't trust the company to protect their data. Wonderful. Next slide, please. Privacy accelerates slides and investments. Evaluating a company's privacy practices is now part of a firm's due diligence, especially when companies are storing customer data in the cloud. Next slide, please. And there's such a strong business case for privacy. It accelerates sales cycles. It grows customer loyalty and trust like no other. It reduces privacy compliance calls. It mitigates penalties. It future-proofs your defensibility, and it reduces litigation and enforcement. Win-win. Next slide, please. And you know this expression, guard your reputation. Trust takes years to build, seconds to destroy, and forever to repair. And trust among the public is at an all-time low today with respect to privacy. Next slide, please. The online privacy lie is how they're referring to it. A large majority of web users are not at all happy. They feel powerless to stop their data from being harvested by users and used by marketers. 91% disagree that if companies give me a discount, it's a fair exchange for them to collect information about me without my knowing it. No, they don't agree with that. 91% disagree with that. And that figure is growing. Next slide, please. Pew Research Internet did a project, and they were talking about the mismatch between behavior and attitudes. And they said context is very important. Users will change their level of disclosure to a company based on the context. So it's really, really important that you protect privacy very, very strongly. Next slide, please. And the trends and challenges, consumer confidence. They're saying that people choose to give their business to firms with good data hygiene, privacy protective practices, new evidence, and consumer confidence. 62% of respondents say they would not at all be likely to repeat a purchase from a company that had shared their personal information with a data broker. Let me just stop for a moment. I'm going to talk about data brokers just to tell you there's a wonderful new book out by Danielle Citron called The Fight for Privacy. And it will shock you how much information data brokers obtain. A growing awareness about companies' uses and consumer data will lead consumers to expect simpler, much more graphical privacy policies. Companies should respond by stress testing their data operations and turn their privacy policies into a marketing opportunity. Yes, you can, privacy and marketing. Next slide, please. I always say this to people. Every year in Canada, the Canadian Marketing Association asks me to come and be a keynote to give a talk at their annual conference. And I always start by saying, I know I'm the least popular speaker here today. And fortunately, they laugh and they say, yes, but we know we need to listen to what you have to say. Because, next slide, please. Privacy by design is a starting point that leads to long-term benefits. And the person who said this was a marketing person, Jessica Carnan, and she said this in Advertising Age, which is what all marketers get. In the next slide, please. I'm copying her. She said, by adopting a privacy by design mentality, we can begin to transform ideas like these into best practices that have long-term benefits for both consumers and brands. Let's lead the way. I love this. Next slide, please. And then she illustrated 3 things companies, marketers should do. Integrate data planning as an upstream design principle, evolve from fine print to the more transparent disclosure strategies, and make privacy a positive part of the brand experience. Make it a positive. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into all of this. This is just for your information, but this is what the Canadian Marketing Association made 10 key points that they got from my annual talk last year. So I thought you should take a look at this. If the Marketing Association is doing this, then there must be something of value here. Next slide, please. The privacy payoff, how marketing and business will benefit from building in privacy. And big data, this is what it's all about. Privacy by design, the global privacy framework. In the next slide, please. This talks about abandoning zero-sum thinking, either or, get rid of the versus, get rid of the win-lose, either or. Next slide, please. Focus on doubly enabling models, marketing and privacy, big data and privacy. Next slide, please. And I want to remind you, yes, privacy is good for business. It is. Next slide, please. If you view privacy as a business issue, not a compliance issue, you will benefit and you will gain a competitive advantage. Next slide, please. I think I've already done this, so let's do one. Next slide, please. How can you embed privacy into your business operations? Let me tell you what one company did, Bearing Media. They developed a cookieless technique to allow ISPs to provide location-based advertising to their customers without disclosing their geolocation data. They used a unique double-blind privacy-enabling data architecture where they deliver both privacy and utility. Bearing Media embraced privacy by design from the start to form the basis of their platform. And they were so successful, this small company was recently acquired by Audience Partners, a marketing and advertising firm. So once again, privacy by design is a starting point that leads to long-term benefits. And that's what I want to keep reminding you of. Next slide, please. By adopting privacy by design mentality, you can transform ideas like this and get long-term benefits. Next slide, please. I like to repeat the 3 points to marketers because a lot of marketers lose sight of this. You can do this, embed it, and have a big success. Next slide, please. And I want to end with some concluding thoughts for you, just to make it clear that privacy and security risks are best managed proactively by proactively embedding the principles of privacy by design into your operations. Prevent the harms from arising. Avoid the data breach by baking privacy by design measures into your operations. Privacy as the default setting. And if you focus on prevention, it's much easier and far more cost-effective to build in privacy and security upfront rather than after the fact. This also reflects the most ethical treatment of personal data. So please abandon zero-sum either-or thinking. Embrace doubly enabling systems, positive sum, privacy and security, privacy and data utility, privacy and marketing. If you get smart and lead with privacy by design, you can avoid what one of my colleagues says, privacy by disaster. So let's get smart and do this. In the next slide is just my contact information. If you have any desire to send me an email, I will always respond to you. And let me turn it back to you, Fernando. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for the presentation.